Hello friends, for today's video I wanted to look at some adult fantasy works that I think are either underhyped or underrated or a combination of both. And I did do a part 1 to this, so if you are looking for more books besides just the ones I mentioned here, I'll have part 1 linked in the description bar down below. And if any of these end up sounding interesting to you, then I'll have links so you can check them out. Before I get into my list, feel free to mention in the comments some adult fantasy works that you think are underhyped, underappreciated, and underrated. That way anybody who comes to this video doesn't just see my recommendations, but they'll have your suggestions as well. All of that said, jumping into it, first up we have the book of Gothel, or I would say the narrator very much said Gothel, which I'm sure I'm still saying that pretty incorrectly, but regardless, when this book was marketed, it came across very much like it was going to be a fairy tale retelling, and I would say that the cover sort of indicates that as well. It was presented as though it would be a fairy tale retelling where you're focusing on the villain, which was very trendy for a while, and that you would be looking at Gothel, the villain specifically of the Rapunzel story. However, this ended up being very different from that. The main character is a pretty ordinary individual, and this is much more historical fiction fantasy. For a long time, I was wondering, is there even actually any fantasy or magic in this, or is it just that it is historical fiction, and so some people believe in things due to there being folklore and such things that cause them to think that there are paranormal things or that there are mystical beings or things like that. And I don't want to reveal too much about whether that turned out to be yes, there is just a focus on people's beliefs at that time, or no, there actually is fantasy, but it is very historical centered. And you're really not looking at fairy tales in the way that we have come to see them very often. It's not diving into whimsy and magic. If anything, and I feel bad categorizing this way because it sounds so negative, but it's kind of dry in a sense. By the way, Luna Bear is nearby, my dog, and she's grumbling. So if you hear her, that's what that noise is. But anyway, so I hesitate to say dry because it has such a negative connotation. It makes it sound like, oh, well then I don't want to get into something that has no life or anything like that. It's not that it lacks depth. It's not that it lacks a voice. It's just that it's not particularly exciting. It's a little bit more slice of life. And it reminds me a bit of things like the Winter Night trilogy or Naomi Novik's Spinning Silver, where you are following a character on their day-to-day life, and then the events at that time that is being portrayed, how those affect the character and how folklore plays a role in their life as well. Our main character is somebody who helps deliver children, really zero in on the idea that at that time that was considered women's work for a lot of them, and it was thus not really something to document, anything to pay much attention to, and it's not the type of story that you would typically find as heroic. And the initial setup in this really took me by surprise because it's basically a woman who is writing in modern time. She's writing about women's work, quote unquote, in history and how it was very much glossed over and that it wasn't well documented because nobody thought it was particularly noteworthy. And then this person is looking at this Gothel character and zeroing in on her and how she sort of defied that. And it's not until a reputation is earned, whether bad or good, that somebody is being paid attention to. Is that person a witch? Are they causing harm to us? Are they causing harm to our children? Because she does deliver children. And so that's kind of where you see the sprinkles of the Rapunzel as well. It really was not what I was expecting, but the reason I talked about the marketing and the reason I'm talking about that kind of conflict between what was presented and then what we actually got is I think that made it so that people were disappointed when they picked it up because it wasn't what they were marketed. And as a result, I think it didn't find its audience. So I know I spent kind of a decent amount of time talking about that one, but it's because I think if the things that I described sound up your alley, then that book is going to be for you. I just don't think it was presented to the right audience, sadly. Next up, completely different from that, this is a book I read very recently, and that would be Ascendant. This is a story that follows a young man named Holt. He's kind of a boy on the cusp of manhood. And he has always had dreams of being a dragon rider. Dragon riders are very revered by a lot of individuals as they fight back the scourge, this kind of monstrous horde that can harm a lot of people. And they're really the only means of fighting back against that. So they're seen as heroes, and Holt has a lot of these visions, and these not literal visions like prophecies, but he just imagines himself as being a dragon rider. And then one day he sees an egg that he discovers is going to be destroyed because the dragons are very picky about what dragons can be in their ranks. And Holt just has that tug at his heartstrings. He just can't stand the idea of this egg being destroyed. So he takes it, it hatches, there's a baby dragon, and he's like, oh my gosh, wait, what have I done? What do I do with this baby dragon? And if you love the boy and his dragon kind of trope or archetype, then I would say you don't need to hear anything else about the story, and that's enough to give it a go. But I do think the way that dragon fantasy is done in this, the lore with the dragons, the significance of them, the sort of different orders of the dragons or the different distinctions based off of their magic, how the magic works, it's all, I think, really unique, even though the idea of the boy and his dragon is something we've seen in fantasy for quite a long time. So I really, really enjoyed this, even though I'm putting it in this video, which is focusing on adult fantasy. I could see this being so fun to buddy read with a teenager or a person who's like 10, 11, 12, because when I first talked about how I feel like it kind of doesn't exist really comfortably within any specific age range. There's so many things about it I think so many ages can really enjoy. I just think it'd be so fun. I'm thinking about when I used to teach private violin lessons, I had students of all different ages, and some of them really liked to read, and I hands down would have handed this to, there's one student in particular who liked a lot of fantasy, and I would have been like, you should read this. And I think it would have been so fun, you know, at the beginning of lessons, before the lesson officially starts, to be like, so how far are you in it? And I just would have had so much fun. So I could see if you are a parent or if you have nieces or nephews or something, that could be such a blast. But also if you don't, it's still a fun book to read on your own. But anyway, moving on. Next up is a book that I have sung its praises time and time again. I still wait for the day that I feel like this picks up, because I really think so many people would like this. It is epic fantasy. There's so many twists and turns. The way in which the setting is done feels unique, but then also somewhat reminiscent of, and I know this gets overstated, so I am often hesitant to say this, but I actually think this is true. It feels a little reminiscent of Game of Thrones, and that would be The Engines of Empire. This is part of the Age of Uprising series. The first 2 books in this are out. It is a multiple perspective story, and you are looking at the Hawksburg Guild. This is a family where you have the matriarch, the mother, and then her children, who are all adults, and each of the children ends up kind of having their own plot lines that are rather separate from one another. So in typical epic fantasy fashion, you are looking at so many different sections of this world. The mother's perspective, I really enjoyed, as that one is very political and having to do very much with the economy and trying to gain what are going to essentially be like the contracts that they need in order for their guild to continue being the best. And she has to analyze, okay, that person over there, they want access to this over here because that's going to give them this, and it was going to open up trade to there, and we can't let that happen, because if that happens, that's going to take away our claim to this. And so you're following her as she is having to manage all of that. Then you have other perspectives that are more having to do with the magic and in ways they didn't really realize existed. So then you're like, what is happening over here? There's like a tiny bit of horror leanings sometimes as well. And then you are looking at, through other perspectives, the consequences of what the Hawksburg Guild does to other countries, to other groups of people, to the planet. So you're watching all these perspectives. It kind of invites you to decide for yourself right and wrong, but then you kind of like these characters. So you're like, well, some of the things they're doing I don't really think are great, but I also get why they're doing it. And also it feels really good when they get one on another guild. And so you're exploring all of those things. And then there's a lot of familial drama. There's a lot of political intrigue. There's a lot of scheming. And there's kind of this clashing of old and new. And the closest thing that I have read that has a similar feel to it, although I think this other series does this much more, would be the Age of Madness series by Joe Abercrombie. It is the second series in his First Law world, where there's kind of this group of people that want more for themselves. They're overworked, they want more rights, and I would say, interestingly, because this is called the Age of Uprising and that series is Age of Madness, the idea of uprising for rights of the people, I feel like is more fitting to Joe Abercrombie's work. I would say these characters are definitely affected by the masses, but there's also elements of how religion and kind of old magic plays a role, and who's trying to attain power and go against the guild. It's all done so well. I don't know if it sounded like there's a cohesive plot in there and how I described it, but that's the thing. Epic fantasy, there's just so much to it because the worlds are really big. It feels like a well fleshed out setting, and thus there's so much to explore. And I really feel like the author does a good job of exploring so many of those different things. It's one of those stories where every time I bring it up, I feel like I could describe it slightly different, and I think that's kind of cool, actually. So anyway, Engines of Empire, if you're looking for epic fantasy, I feel like that one is fantastic. Next up, not epic fantasy, and that would be The Thorns Remain. This one, I think, is both underhyped and underrated. Similar to what I was saying about the Book of Gothel, I think it is very much how this book was presented that worked against it. Speaking of slice of life, because I kind of said that about Book of Gothel, this is so slice of life. You are following this rural area where this young woman is working on, she has a lot of labor that involves the land and making sure they have enough to eat and washing their clothes. And it also has a historical fiction setting, but there has been a war and it has affected a lot of the people that live in this very small village. And so you're kind of seeing the villagers pick up the pieces, and there are some very obvious pieces missing. There are gaps in how everything works, how everything flows, and just the personal connections and joys that they had with these people who are no longer with them. And our main character is dealing with loss and grief, which I think that's done really well in this story. But one day her and her friends are talking about things to come. What are they going to do with their lives once they are officially adults? Because they are kind of at that age where they have to decide, are we going to stay here? Are we going to move to a city and go somewhere and make something of ourselves somewhere else, or be educated somewhere? And they're having all these conversations. And the Fae find them, and when our main character wakes up, she's the only one who has not been taken by the Fae. All of her friends from that night are gone, and the Fae have tricked everyone in this village into thinking all of those individuals left months ago. They already made the decision to go into the city, and our main character is just the only one that stayed behind. And she knows this is not true. She knows that the Fae have her friends. She wants to do everything she can to get them back. The fact that life is so labor intensive means that she can't just drop everything to go on this quest to save her friends. She still has to basically, milk the cows and get the food and what, I mean, I'm very much generalizing here, but you get the idea that she can't just up and leave everything. She's not equipped for that. She has a family that she cares about. She cares about the other villagers. They become suspicious of her. The Fae are working with their capabilities to try and turn the villagers against her, to make her quest to get her friends back that much harder. But again, quest is more of just like her trying her best while trying to live her life. But the commentary on grief, I think, is very, very well done. And I think maybe this would be an unexpected thing based off of what I described, but I would also say the commentary on manipulative relationships is very, very well done. The way in which your whole sense of reality can be warped, the way that somebody can twist you into believing that you are better off alone because look at how nobody else cares about you. The intent to isolate you from other people, but doing that with a combination of folklore elements, I thought was very well done, but it is so slow. I have no problem admitting that, but I didn't mind because I liked diving into the kind of like the psyche of the character. From there, we have the Sword Defiant, speaking of the psyche of the character. So in this, you are looking at what happens to all of our heroes after they've defeated the Dark Lord. And it turns out they're pretty depressed. That's kind of the setup of the story. That's pretty much all you need to know. And our main character is somebody who, he did it. He saved the day. Him and all the stereotypical, the dwarf, the beautiful elf, you know, all of those kinds of characters. They defeated the dark necromancer lord type of character. And he doesn't know really what he's doing with his life. He feels like everybody reveres him, treats him so well, and he doesn't really feel like he's earned any of it. He doesn't really know what he's doing with his life. He also isn't sure the thread is gone. And so I think that it's kind of on surface level. It is an examination of that concept of the fantasy trope, everybody saves the day, but then what would happen after? But on top of that, I do feel like digging a little deeper, it's kind of like what happens to people who have faced violence and battle, and then they're asked to just live life now. What is that like for them? And I think this book explores that pretty well. It is the first book in a series, and I do intend to at some point pick up the sequel, but I think a lot of the themes, I'm not trying to encourage people to only read the first book by any means, but I think a lot of the themes are done well within this first book, and I don't actually know what we're going to get with the sequel. It ends very much in a position of, are we about to go on another adventure? Sounds too chipper, but I'll go ahead and call it that. Are we about to go on another adventure? Do we need to save the day again? It has a feeling of that, certainly, so it's not like out of nowhere, all of a sudden we're just going to have a sequel for no reason. There is a plot pushing things forward, because of course things don't ever just wrap up nicely in a bow and end and then now everything's good. There are still things to fight against, and our character is kind of just always grappling with the idea of, am I the one that's supposed to lead the charge? Am I the one that's supposed to be picking the sword back up? And speaking of swords, if you like the idea of the sentient object and the sword that tries to get you to do things that you don't really want to do, but at the same time it's really powerful, so it can help you, but you resist using it because it might take you over, that kind of thing, you might like that about the Sword Defiant. Last for today, we have a Green Rider. I have definitely hyped this one up, I would say, a fair amount this year, as I read it not too long ago. My friend Sarah, who has her own channel, is, I feel like, pretty much the only other person I see talk about this series, and she's way further ahead in the series than me. I have only read the first book at the time that I'm filming this, and I hope to keep going with it very soon, because I really liked the first one, and the series is still going, and I think it's wrapping up very soon. So it's a good time to jump on the train for this, but it's just not a book I see talked about very often on BookTube. It has that classic fantasy feel. It seems as though you're kind of following this character as they're on this quest that they are kind of ill-equipped for. And I do think that where some other stories have this chosen one who, yeah, they're just a regular old farm boy, but they're gonna achieve great things, it doesn't quite do that. It's more of like our characters trying to do the right thing after somebody comes to her begging for her help, and she's like, okay, I guess I'll help. And in doing this, she gets caught up in a lot of dangerous things, and she's trying to do her absolute best. But that means you do see her make mistakes. You do see her, you actually see somebody who's not just amazing. They're just so good at everything because they're the chosen one. There's not that feeling in this. I feel like you're following realistically what it'd be like if a just regular old person took it upon themselves to help someone and then was thrust into a lot of circumstances that are outside of their capabilities. And I think that was really well done. I liked the quest feeling. It does kind of have that like good versus evil. There's a dark lord that we're trying to fight back against. It has a lot of the ingredients of classic fantasy, and certainly done in a way though that I think makes it so that it's compelling. It doesn't feel like same old, same old. It doesn't feel like it's just a copy paste. And I think that's very much in part due to our main character, but also just there is like a sense of whimsy to this. It feels like you're getting all cozy by the campfire and you're hearing this tale. And I thought the first book, while it ends in a way where you can see where it's going to continue on, I still feel like this first book had a satisfying ending to its arc, and I'm excited to see where it goes next. But if you're somebody who really likes classic fantasy and you want to read something that feels very similar to that, then I think this one you're going to really enjoy. That's it though for some adult fantasy works that I think deserve a little bit more love. Like I said at the beginning, feel free to leave your own recommendations in the comments. I'll have all of these linked in the description bar if you're interested in any of them. Thanks so much for watching though. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later.